How do? My name is Andrew Hancock and I am a VMware technical architect from Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. I have worked with VMware since their birth in 1998, so that has been over 24 years I've been working with the VMware product catalogue. Some of my close colleagues may say, if you cut Andy in half these days, it reads VMware like a stick of rock from Blackpool Pleasure Beach. I have now written 130 articles and recorded 10 hours of VMware vSphere videos for Experts Exchange and received 41 Experts Exchange awards over the last 10 years working with the Experts Exchange community. I am currently the overall #1 point earner in the Hall of Fame at Experts Exchange. I am honoured to have been accepted into the VMware vExpert program since 2011 and more recently a VMware vExpert Pro for the last 3 years.
Hi there and welcome back to another edition of Hancock's VMware Half Hour. I'm fueled up, I've got my Java and from my Experts Exchange, the original tech community coffee mug, and this is actually my favourite coffee mug at the moment. So I'm just going to have a big swig of espresso. Okay, so welcome back, and we're back with our single host, our PowerEdge R730, managed by VMware vCenter Server 7, and I've showed you in previous videos and articles of how to install vCenter Server 7 and how to add hosts to vCenter Server 7. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how we add 2 more hosts. Now, I've already covered this before in a video that I did here, but I thought I'd actually go over it again because this time we're going to add some hosts, and I'm going to go over and do exactly the same configuration that I did in the last video of how we actually add NFS storage. So this is a little bit of a repeat, but we can use one of the later features in vSphere now to quickly present storage that's already on one host to other hosts. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Then probably going to have a break, and then we're probably going to come back to another video where I actually talk about EVC, because the hosts that we're adding are 2 older PowerEdge R720s, and they actually use from memory Xeon CPU and E5-2690-V2, and in the Dell PowerEdge R730, and if we do a Google, I like to use the Intel's Arc. So I'm just basically going to do a quick Google for, and I'm going to do V2 because I know that the PowerEdge uses the V2 Xeon. And I just wanted to show you, if we actually use Intel's own product specifications, if you're not aware of what processor families exist. So the CPUs in our R720s are Ivy Bridge, and our processors in the R730 is a Haswell. And if you're mixing and matching older generation CPUs with newer generation CPUs in a cluster, which we're going to talk about, and I'm going to show you how to create a cluster and how we add hosts to a cluster. You can add older and new generation CPUs to a single cluster. No issues at all, no problems at all. They will coexist and they will run. The only slight gotcha and issue that you will ever encounter is if you wish to vMotion, and vMotion is a trademark patented technology that's owned by VMware. vMotion is a live migration, so the ability to migrate a virtual machine, guest OS, from one host to another host in real time with no downtime. And when I saw this technology in early 2000, I was gobsmacked that we could migrate virtual machines, guest OSs, from one host to another host in real time with no downtime. Okay, occasionally you may see one ping drop, as of course you're moving between hosts and obviously networking is changing and it takes a while, a couple of microseconds for the routing, etc., and the traffic to find out where it's actually going. But when I foresaw this, I was blown away. But that was a long time ago. So I'm not quite sure these days really that we call it technology, because I don't really refer to a light switch when I turn a light switch. When I turn a light on using a light switch, I don't turn around and regard that as technology. It just happens. And I think today in 2022, vMotion just happens. But if you're vMotioning from one host to another host with different CPUs, if you just step back from a moment and think about running an operating system on a machine with a particular CPU in it, and in real time you're going to swap that CPU, if you could, if you could have an operating system running on a physical PC and you were able to get inside the machine and undo the ZIF socket or the socket 7 or whatever socket type it's got, 1152, etc. If you were to able to take that CPU out and put another CPU in without the machine actually blue screening or crashing, the chances are it's likely to crash anyway, because the operating system is using the instruction set, or using all the instruction set that are effectively running on that Haswell processor. And all of a sudden, if the actual guest OS finds that it's now running on an Ivy Bridge and it doesn't have those instruction sets that it was using, then it will crash. So quite simply, EVC applies a baseline across your cluster. So all, as far as the virtual machines are concerned, they're all running at the same baseline level. So going back to our data center cluster here, we have a host with a V3 chip, version 3 Xeon, which is Haswell, and the hosts that we're going to add have a V2 chip, 2690 V2, which is an Ivy Bridge. So live migrating a virtual machine between the two is not possible unless we actually create an EVC baseline. And the EVC baseline that we create is effectively the lowest common denominator. So here we're going to have two hosts that we add, which are Ivy Bridge, and we've got a host which has a Haswell, so therefore we would create an EVC baseline of Ivy Bridge. So that's a mask that's applied across the cluster so that all the virtual machines see a CPU with Ivy Bridge instructions only. Now, there is one caveat to this. Again, you cannot apply an EVC baseline, for instance, LabNAS and VMware vCenter Server and Saltair here. They're all running currently, they're all powered up currently on this particular host using that particular chip with those Haswell instructions. We cannot apply an EVC baseline of Ivy Bridge to that host whilst these machines are powered up. You have to make sure that the machines are powered off. And this is a little bit like a game of the Towers of Hanoi. I don't know if you remember, the Towers of Hanoi is a little wooden block, and it's got little wooden rings on it, and it's 3 little posts, and the idea basically is to move them to, I think, from one post to another host in order to get them all back on. It's a similar juggling operation that we really have to do if you are adding hosts into a cluster that's already up and running, standalone, and you're adding in hosts and you've already got machines powered up and you've got a VMware vCenter server already running, then you have to sort of kind of think logically about a specific procedure that you need to go through to add all those hosts, turn them on and off, turn the machines on and off, juggle them all around. But anyway, we'll get into that probably in the next video, because today I want to quickly show you as to how we add these hosts. So, better get started. Better wet me whistle with my EE Original Tech Community mug. Sorry for the EE plugs, but this is an Experts Exchange video. Okay, so I've talked long enough about FQDNs. So I have 2 new hosts. They're patched exactly to the same level. So they're running VMware ESXi 7.03 194.82537, which is the 7.0.3 D release. So there's a number of ways that you could do this. You could create a cluster and you could add them straight into the cluster, or you could just add them. So I think we'll do both. We'll got 2 hosts, so we'll basically do different mechanisms to both hosts, and I'll show you. So FQDN, again, important. Make sure you've got your DNS working correctly and you're using FQDNs throughout. It may seem like an awful lot of work initially, and I see this an awful lot of time with questions being asked at Experts Exchange. I know we all want to get in and start basically doing stuff very quickly with our servers. I've been there, I've done it, and we want to do it quickly. We don't want to read manuals, so basically we just get in there, bang, 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 bang. IP addresses, brilliant. Yes, it's all working. Later on, it will catch up with you, believe you me. So take a step back, make sure that you've got good working DNS, 2 DNS servers. Get all the FQDNs, the IP addresses and the FQDNs registered. Get the DNS information specified in your host and in your vCenter server, and then you can carry on and use FQDNs in the future. I'll give you an example. A lot of the time I think we get questions about people asking, I need to change the IP address of my ESXi host. How do I do this? If you're using FQDNs, it doesn't actually make any difference, because you would just change the IP address on your DNS server. If you're using FQDNs throughout, it isn't going to affect vCenter server. It isn't going to affect your environment. You just change the IP addresses on your DNS server, and everything will carry on working correctly. If you've been using fixed IP addresses, then that's when the problem really becomes a problem, because you've actually physically got to go into the host, change its IP address, and then remove that basically from vCenter server, and then add it back. Okay, so enough on FQDNs. So there's my host, ESXi009.cyrus-consultants.co.uk, and as I think I mentioned before, we use odd numbers on this particular lab, and the other lab we used evens. So I'm just going to click next. Okay, so I'm going to type in its password, the root password, that one of course that you've recorded and you've written, followed by next. Okay, so yes, it's a Dell, yes, it's a PowerEdge R720, and yes, that's a virtual machine. That's the version. It doesn't have any virtual machines currently, so I'm going to click next. I'm going to use an evaluation license. We'll sort that out later. And I'm not going to use lockdown mode, and I'm going to select the VM location for EE Training Data Center, followed by next, and followed by finish. And we can see it there, it's disconnected, and we can see it's being added as a standalone host there, and it's in maintenance mode because I left these servers in maintenance mode when I shut them down. And there's our NFS Lab NAS. Just a couple of things to mention. Overnight I have moved our DNS server Swordtail to NFS Lab, and I've also moved our VMware vCenter Server 7 to NFS Lab as well. And I used the migrate function, which I've showed you before in another video quite simply. Now obviously I can't move Lab NAS still exists on our spinning Rust local data center. Of course I can't really move that to local storage, because if I move that to local storage and it's a virtual machine, I then actually can't power that virtual machine up if it's on local storage. It's on shared storage. If it's on shared storage, which itself is provisioning, so that has to stay on our spinning Rust for the moment. So that's our first host added, and We'll talk about these later. Lots of blue warnings about vulnerability issues, no data stores. Well, it's obvious there's no data stores. There's no local disks in this particular machine. No core dump, system logs, etc. on non-persistent storage. So we can talk about those later. I'll leave them there for the time being. So that's just added as a standalone. So this is the data center. This is a standalone host, and this is a standalone host. So there's another way that we could add a host. We could add a host direct to a cluster. So I'm going to create our first cluster, and I'm going to call it the EE cluster. I'm not going to enable vSphere DRS at the moment, or HA or vSAN, and I'm going to click next, and I'm going to click finish. A cluster. What is a cluster? A cluster is just a group of resources, CPU and memory. That's all a cluster is. Effectively, it's a resource pool of memory and CPU that we can add hosts into. So I'm going to now right click our cluster, but before I do that, I'm going to edit the settings on our cluster, and I'm going to look at VMware EVC, and I want to, so that I can demonstrate the migration of guest OS's virtual machines from one host to another host when we configure vMotion in a later video. I want to enable an EVC baseline already. So I'm going to select the Ivy Bridge generation. I think if I actually turn around and say I'll try and do a Haswell generation and click OK, I think it's probably going to fail, he says. Of course, at the moment, I haven't actually basically got any hosts in there. So let's see what happens if we actually drag and drop this host into our cluster. Okay, there we go. We've got a little pop-up here. The host CPU hardware does not match the support the cluster's enhanced vMotion capability. And can we see the reason why? Obviously, this is a Sandy Bridge CPU. It's not a Haswell, and it's not supported. So if I just go back again and I edit and I select Ivy Bridge, and we'll do exactly the same thing again. We'll drag and drop. So now we have one host in an EE cluster, which is currently running on an EVC baseline of Sandy Bridge. So this time I'm going to do exactly the same. I'm going to do something slightly different this time. I'm currently highlighting the cluster, actions, and I'm going to add a host. So this time I'm actually going to add a host direct into the cluster. So again, ESXi 011, Synology Consultants, a couple of typos there. Now, if you've got lots of hosts, you could add them all the way down here. In exactly the, I could have done that with the first host, but I wanted to show you the different ways that we can do it. You can either add hosts standalone and then move them into the cluster by drag and drop, or we can add them in using add to cluster rather than add to the data center. Followed by next. And it's saying it can't contact that, and that's because, again, I can't even read. I'm looking for my glasses. I don't know what I've done with them. You know, maybe I need another swig of an espresso. Okay, followed by next. There we go. Okay, so similar dialogue, a response. 7.03 Dell PowerEdge R720, followed by next, followed by finish. So you can see here it's adding multiple hosts, multiple single hosts. Adds it initially to the, there we go, it all happened very quick there. Added it standalone first and then basically dropped it into the cluster. So there we have two hosts currently in an EE cluster with an EVC baseline of Ivy Bridge. Now let's just see what happens, because ultimately what we really want to have, the end game here, is that we have all three hosts in the same cluster with an EVC baseline of Ivy Bridge, so that we can actually migrate virtual machines in real time between hosts. Remember, of course, that we can only migrate virtual machines between hosts if we have shared storage. The shared storage we have here is provided by Lab NAS. So what actually happens if we actually just try and drop that host there on that cluster? What's going to happen? Okay, it's telling us that the host cannot be admitted to the cluster because it's got powered on virtual machines, which is what I was actually saying to you before, that the fact that we've got three machines that are all powered on, there's no way that we can put that baseline across that host with those powered up virtual machines. So those would all have to be powered off. Now, of course, this is where the conundrum comes up, that if we power that off, and we power that off, and we power that off, and our vCenter server is currently running on shared storage, which is provided by Lab NAS, and Swordtail is our DNS server, which is also running on our shared storage, we can't actually apply the baseline to it because these are all powered on. And if we power off vCenter server, we can't apply, we can't move the server, and if we power off Lab NAS, then we don't have vCenter server. So we have to think of a logical process into way that we do that, and I'll talk about that in the next video after this one, so please come back and look at that video. Because one of the things I wanted to show you very quickly now is I wanted to present the storage that we have. Lab NAS, our NFS data store. I want to provide that storage there, NFS lab-NAS, to our two servers here. So we've got shared storage, which is basically connected to all our hosts. So what I'm going to do first is, okay, we've got expired licenses or something, I'll ignore that. What I want to do first of all is I want to enable SSH on our new hosts, and I've showed you how to do this. So just a quick recap, that we're just starting the ESXi shell. No, I don't want to stop. I'm just starting up the ESXi shell, starting SSH, and I'm going to do that here as well. I'm doing this because I want to actually check that we do have communications before we get into any difficulties and error messages. Okay, so I've got SSH connected. Showed you how to do this in the video previously, so let's just log into the servers. Because we've got to practice what we preach, and in the previous video I showed you how to actually use VMK ping and ping to actually basically check that we've got communication to our NAS. So we're going to do exactly the same thing that we've done before. If we look at our virtual switches here, and it's this here that I'm basically wanting to do and recreate almost. We don't need to create the NFS Storage network virtual machine port group on the other servers. All we need to do is basically just drop and create a VM kernel NFS storage. Now let's have a little look at number 9. Okay, VM kernel port group. I'm gonna sort of kind of, to make sure that these are all roughly the same, I'm just going to create a VM kernel network adapter on just doing this really so that the actual the VM kernel port groups are exactly the same, because we've got one here, VMK0, VMK1, so I just want them to be the same, because here we've got the management network and we've got a VM kernel here, so just wanting to make sure that they're sort of kind of consistent. Okay, so we want to create a new VM kernel adapter. So this is our vSwitch 1 and this is our storage. So again, IP settings, IP. We don't want any of those services, because this is just for NFS traffic. And before, I think I used 10.10.1.1 for the other service. I'm going to call this 10.2. I think from memory, I think I've probably maybe roughly got that right. So VM kernel NFS storage is on VMK2. And I just want to be consistent to get everything matching. VM kernel NFS storage. Yeah, okay. Looks okay. So we've created again that special VM kernel NFS storage interface with the IP address of 10.10.1.2. And I'm just going to basically go to our host, and I'm going to do a quick check. So 10.10.1.1 is the other VMK kernel on ESXi 007, so they're communicating. 10.10.1.2 is the IP address of this host, ESXi 009, and remember 200 is the actual NAS itself. Now that's using ping. And of course, I did say that if we use VMK ping followed by -i, VMK2, same IP address, -s 9000. Now that confirms that we're sending a large packet out of VMK2 to our NAS. So ESXi 009, I'm pretty confident that we should be able to get a connection. Now there's one thing that I know in my head that's not currently configured, and I'm going to show you that. So I'm going to deliberately watch this fail in a minute. So we're going to do exactly the same thing with our ESXi 011 host, number 11. So I'm going to add networking again. For consistency, continuity, I'm just going to make sure that we've got another VM kernel on vSwitch 0, so the continuity between all the hosts is exactly the same, so I don't confuse you. Well, I don't confuse myself. And okay, so that's picked up an IP address of 192.168.182.1.5. That's via DHCP, and I'm not too bothered about that at the moment. So I'm going to add another networking interface. So again, VM kernel network adapter for NFS traffic. I'm going to create a new vSwitch, jumbo frames. Just a little side about jumbo frames. Your mileage may vary with jumbo frames. Sometimes jumbo frames can enhance performance of NFS and iSCSI. Sometimes it may not. It's really suck it and see. Sometimes you will see performance increase. Sometimes you won't. So again, we're going to add vmnic 01. Again, I'm going to call it NFS Storage. I'm not going to use any of the services. This is just a dedicated network, and it's a dedicated physical network because I've actually got the interfaces on the hosts connected out to a dedicated storage switch, which is completely independent of any of the other switches here. So it's just going to run our NFS traffic, and it's not going to run any other traffic. I'm going to use a static IP address 10.10.1.3, followed by next, and followed by finish. So if I have a little look at our whole putty down here, and we're going to do the same thing. 10.10.1.1. Okay, good. 2, 3. So that's just confirms that I can communicate using ping on that storage network. But the magic BMK ping -I BMK2 10.10.1.200 -S 9000. Okay, good. So in summary, we've just again added 4 VM kernel. We've added 2 to SX009, we've added 2 to 11, and the one that we're interested in is VMK2, which is the VM kernel NFS storage. We're going to send our traffic down, which is where the data store is going to be. So we're now all ready to present that storage to our 2 hosts here. Okay, so it wasn't that long ago, and we're just looking at the time here, 31 minutes. So again, you know, Hancock's VMware half hour's gone over again. What do you know? Okay, so this is really where I wanted to actually basically get to in this video, and we'll do this, and then we'll wrap up, and then we'll come back and we'll look at EVC and clustering in the next video. So this is a feature that was implemented. I can't really remember now when this appeared, but once upon a time we would have to go to each individual host, and we'd have to go through the same rigmarole of adding all the data centers individually to each host, or a lot of us would script it because it's time consuming manually driving it through the GUI. But there's a newer feature. If we've already got a data store presented to one host, so if we look at these icons across the top, this is hosts and clusters, this is virtual machines and templates, and this is data store. The other one there is networks. So you can see all the networks that actually exist within your environment, in your data center. So if we click data stores, we can see all the data centers that actually exist. So this is our local data center, our spinning SSD on ESXi 007. This is our shared storage, which is running on that Synology NAS, and that's our spinning Rust data store. So wasn't that long ago that we'd have to basically manually add this particular any data store to each shared storage to each individual host. But now we have a function that basically says that we can mount data stores to additional hosts. So I'll just show you that again. So if you select data stores, if you select the shared data store, and there you can see the actual virtual machines that are actually on that NFS export. There's our VMware vCenter Server 7, a test folder, remember, that I created, and Swordtail, our DNS server. So if we actually select actions and we select mount data stores to additional hosts, then here we can see that we can select these two and we can mount away without actually going to each individual host and going through that add new data store which I showed you initially. And it's also intelligent enough to actually come up and turn around and tell us they're incompatible and a reason. Now we've done all the legwork, we've done all the donkey work here to ensure that the networking is all correct. So I'm going to select these two hosts, and I'm going to click OK, and we're going to see what happens. Oh dear. Now, I might have mentioned to you a couple of minutes ago, 35 minutes now, I might have mentioned to you a couple of minutes ago that there was a reason in my madness. I didn't want to change something because I wanted to show you this. I wanted to show you that clearly an error has occurred during the host configuration and it's failed. And there is a reason for that. And you may remember, or not, if I go back to my lab NAS configuration, which is my Synology NAS, you may remember, or you can go back and you can have a little look at that video that I did, the last video. But if I go back to our control panel and I go back to file services and I go back to shared folder and I edit the shared folder and I look at the NFS permissions, can you remember that I actually specifically gave privileges to the client 10.10.1.1, which was our first ESXi 007 host, and I've not actually given permissions to any other client to contact and mount that NFS export. So this is actually some inbuilt security ACL that if I'd have just removed that, then any NFS connection could actually connect to that mount. So it's not as good as Kerberos authentication, which uses obviously a username, a password, and a ticket and a token. But it's a bit better than just leaving it completely open. So if I just click edit, if I just drop 1.2, 1.3 and click save. So I've actually now added those hosts 009 and 011 into their ACLs. So now hopefully we shouldn't get any errors. I'm just going to go up here and just click hosts, so you can see at the moment it actually shows that the only host actually using that data store is ESXi 007 10.10.1.1. So again, I'm going to go up to actions, I'm going to go mount to additional data stores, I'm going to tick that box, I'm going to click OK, fingers crossed, slurp of coffee, it's coming to an end, so the video's coming to an end, and hopefully, there we go. Done. So, you can see now that hosts ESXi 009 and 011 are both now connected to NFS Lab NAS. And if you don't believe me, if I go and look at the data stores, then it shows me the only data store here. Now that's interesting, because that says it's NFS 3. So it's done an NFS 3 connection, and interesting, because at some point I did think that we were running NFS 4.1. Something's dropped back in our configuration somewhere to NFS 3. Now of course Lab NAS is, if we just check, I'm not going to dwell on this because I could be sat, the video could end up being, okay, so the maximum NFS protocol is NFS 4.1. We definitely were running 4.1 in the previous video. So something has dropped back to 3. And I have no idea why it's dropped back to a 3 rather than a 4. I'll correct that in a previous video. Just something I've noticed now. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm not going to go on much longer because you're probably your attention span's probably after 5 minutes probably is you're not interested anymore. Anyway, okay, so just to recap very quickly, we've added 2 new hosts to our EE cluster. We've created an EE cluster. We've added 2 hosts to the EE cluster. I added 1 as standalone. I added 1 direct to the cluster. We created an EVC baseline of Ivy Bridge on that EE cluster. And we've added some VM kernel port groups, 4 VM kernel port groups, 2 to ESXi 009, 2 to ESXi 011, and we've added the storage, and we made some modifications to the ACL on our NAS so we could do that. And we've ended up, for some strange reason, running NFS 3 rather than NFS 4.1, and welcome to my world. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. It's been an absolute pleasure, and please come back, and we can have a little look at EVC. So anyway, thank you very much, and come back soon. Thank you. Bye bye.